Hello, everyone. I hope you will support the discussion in the comments and tell me what you would do if you found yourself in the situations I am going to talk about today. You know how you can live somewhere for years and then, suddenly, a new neighbor shows up bringing a storm of drama with them? That's exactly what happened to me. My name's Jack, and I own a quiet little house at the end of the street, bordered by trees and away from the main chaos. I've never been part of the homeowners association here, and honestly, I've always been glad. I've heard stories about HOAs and how they can be downright oppressive, but I never thought I'd end up being on the receiving end of their wrath. So, 3 years ago, the nightmare began when a couple moved into the neighborhood. Greg and his wife, Sharon, they were in their mid-40s with an over-the-top obsession for neighborhood order. I like to keep to myself, but within a week of them moving in, they introduced themselves, made some polite chit-chat, and then launched into a lengthy speech about the benefits of joining the HOA. I gave them a vague nod and moved on, thinking that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. A few weeks later, Greg started popping by with HOA flyers. He'd say, "You really should join, Jack. It's good for property values, keeps the area safe." I'd just nod and say, "I'm good, thanks." My reluctance clearly didn't sit well with him. It wasn't long before the HOA started sending me friendly reminders about dues, membership benefits, and even a few warnings about the importance of community standards. I ignored them all, hoping they'd get the hint. Then, one day, a cop knocked on my door. Greg had called 911, claiming I had illegal structures in my backyard. The officer seemed embarrassed as he looked over my simple patio setup: a grill, a hammock, and a few chairs. After a brief conversation, he left, telling me to have a nice day. But Greg didn't stop there. Over the next month, he reported me to the police 3 more times for things like disturbing the peace and suspected unlicensed pets. Each time, it was nonsense. And each time, the cops left shaking their heads. When his 911 calls didn't work, Greg escalated. One morning, I woke up to find a letter from an attorney demanding I join the HOA and pay retroactive dues for the past several years. It was ridiculous, of course. I wasn't legally required to join, and I hadn't signed any HOA agreement when I bought the house. But Greg and Sharon were determined to make my life miserable. I did my research and found that there was no legal standing for them to enforce HOA rules on non-members like me. Feeling confident, I replied to their attorney with a certified letter, clearly explaining that I wasn't under any obligation to join or pay a cent. I thought that would be the end of it. But that's when Greg and Sharon truly went off the deep end. They began organizing neighborhood watches that would literally stake out in front of my house, scrutinizing everything I did. If I parked my car even slightly skewed, I'd get another notice or warning about unauthorized street parking. They even tried to fine me for not planting enough flowers in my yard to meet the neighborhood's aesthetic standard. But the real breaking point came when I noticed Greg sneaking around my backyard, taking photos through the bushes. I confronted him, and he gave me some nonsense about ensuring the safety and harmony of our community. I warned him that if he didn't stop, I'd be the one calling the police. But Greg wasn't one to back down. A few days later, I received a formal lawsuit in the mail. Greg and Sharon, on behalf of the HOA, were suing me for violations of neighborhood standards and failure to maintain property values. They were demanding thousands of dollars in fines and mandatory membership in the HOA. I was furious and done with the nonsense. I hired a sharp attorney and gathered every piece of evidence I had, from police reports about Greg's baseless 911 calls to photos of his creepy stakeouts. In court, we tore apart every claim Greg and Sharon had made. The judge was visibly annoyed by their flimsy arguments and obviously saw through their harassment campaign. But the kicker? When my attorney brought up the 911 abuse and showed proof of Greg photographing my property without consent, the judge ordered a full restraining order against both Greg and Sharon. To top it all off, the court imposed fines on them for harassment, and they had to reimburse my legal fees. The HOA, facing potential lawsuits from others who might come forward after hearing my story, decided to dissolve altogether. Greg and Sharon packed up and moved within a month, looking embarrassed every time they had to drive past my house. I finally had my peace back. Sometimes I catch myself chuckling, thinking of all the trouble they went through, only for it to blow up spectacularly in their faces. Before the next story, I would like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Let's move on to the next story. When I was 10 years old, the world I knew was shattered. My parents, the 2 people who had built my entire world, were killed in a hit-and-run accident on a quiet evening. My dad was just 39, and my mom, 35. It's strange thinking back to realize how young they were and how much life they still had ahead of them. But one careless, unknown driver ripped it all away in an instant, leaving me to piece together what life could possibly mean without them. We lived in a small, almost picturesque town where everybody knew each other. It was the kind of place where Sunday service wasn't just about faith. It was about catching up with neighbors, learning the latest gossip, and feeling like a part of something. My dad had never been one for city life. He inherited a small fortune early on, and rather than staying in the big city, he and my mom chose this peaceful town where he could run an antique store. It wasn't just a business. It was a passion for both of them. My mom had a deep love for collecting antiques. Her eyes would light up whenever she found a hidden gem, something she knew had a story, a history, even if it was worn or dusty. That little shop held pieces of the past that felt like tiny time capsules, each one carrying its own secrets. Without any relatives to take me in, my future was uncertain. I was on the brink of being placed in an orphanage when a couple from our church, the Banks, stepped forward. They were the kind of people who wore their faith as publicly as their Sunday clothes. They took the opportunity to make a grand gesture in front of everyone, putting on quite the display. Mrs. Banks, who was known for her dramatic flair, stood up and announced that a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. Even at 10, I remember feeling a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort, though I couldn't quite explain it at the time. Looking back, I can almost hear the rehearsed performative tone in her voice, so I went to live with them, the Banks. They had a daughter, Kitty, who was only a year older than me. You'd think that would mean we'd become the best of friends, like sisters maybe, but Kitty and I were worlds apart from the start. She was the golden child, the girl who did everything just right and carried herself with an air of superiority. Kitty wasn't exactly cruel, but she wasn't warm either. She had her own social circle and her own ambitions, which didn't include making room for me. The Banks received a monthly stipend from the state to support me, but they also received substantial checks from my dad's estate, intended to cover my care until I turned 18. After that, the remaining inheritance would be under my control. At first, I didn't fully understand what all this meant. I was a kid, and finances were an adult thing. But as I grew older, I started to understand more than they probably thought I did. I saw the new things in the house, the fancy clothes for Kitty, and the vacations that the Banks seemed to be taking more frequently. Behind closed doors, they weren't outright abusive, but they made it clear they expected something in return. They liked to subtly remind me that they were giving me a home and that good Christians know how to be grateful. Publicly, however, they made an art of doting on me, acting as if I were some beloved treasure they'd been blessed to protect. They'd fawn over me in this overly sweet way, showering me with words and gestures that felt as hollow as an empty vase. Even Kitty was roped into it, forced to act friendly and sisterly towards me whenever we were in public, much to her dismay. When social workers came by to check in, the Banks became model parents. Mrs. Banks would coach me before each visit, instructing me on what to say, reminding me to praise their kindness and godly hearts. She'd repeat that last part as if it were some magical phrase that could hypnotize the social worker. And for a while, it worked. I went along with it, partly because I didn't want any more upheaval in my life, and partly because I didn't feel like I had a choice. Once the social worker left, the facade would drop, and things would return to normal. I was the silent background character in their lives, a necessary inconvenience who came with a paycheck. They continued living their lives, spending money on things that had nothing to do with me. It was clear, even as I grew from a tween into a teenager, that they saw my inheritance as a pot of gold they could dip into at will. Bit by bit, I began to notice that they were setting money aside for Kitty's future, likely intending to cover her college tuition with the funds meant for me. By the time I was 17, it was clear they were treating my trust fund like their own personal piggy bank. I wasn't supposed to notice, of course. They never outright discussed money around me, and the checks were never handed to me directly. But curiosity and frustration led me to start looking at the numbers. As time passed, they began to drop not-so-subtle hints about how I owed them. They'd talk about how, when I gained control of my inheritance, I should show gratitude by giving back to them. Mrs. Banks would sigh about the financial burdens they'd taken on for my sake, as if I had ever asked them to do so. It was a strange mixture of guilt-tripping and entitlement, and even as a teenager, I was beginning to see through it. As I grew older, I became more aware of the subtle ways the Banks were using me. Little clues were everywhere, as though they didn't care if I noticed or simply assumed I wouldn't understand. I'd watch them claim expenses on my behalf, only to see the benefits go towards something for Kitty or some new luxury in their lives. My parents' money was slowly slipping through their fingers, transformed into things that I'd never even touch, let alone enjoy. One particular possession, though, stayed in the back of my mind, a stunning set of Baroque-era china. My mom had never kept it at the store, but instead kept it carefully wrapped in storage at home, safe from handling. She'd told me in one of those tender mother-daughter moments that it was a treasure passed down for generations, and worth an unimaginable amount of money. While I didn't fully grasp its value back then, I knew it was something precious, something irreplaceable. My mom had even joked that it was fit for royalty because of its age and quality, but it was meant to be mine someday. This china set was my only personal tie to my parents' antique shop. After their deaths, Mrs. Banks seized nearly all the antiques from the shop and either kept them for herself or gave them to Kitty. But the Baroque set was different. both in its beauty and significance. Mrs. Banks, for some reason, assumed I wouldn't care about it. She was dead wrong. Even though I wasn't interested in antiques the way my mom was, I knew this set was valuable, both financially and sentimentally. Yet Mrs. Banks would always talk about how it would be Kitty's wedding gift someday, as though it were her decision to make. Her words stung every time she said them, the way she talked about my family's heirloom as if it were already hers. She assumed, because of my tomboyish style and disinterest in the antiques she'd pilfered, that I'd happily let go of this too. But I couldn't let it go. My mother's words about things not defining us had a wisdom to them. But hearing Mrs. Banks dismiss my rightful inheritance, something my mom had taken such care to preserve, wasn't something I could ignore. As Kitty's high school graduation came around, my plans began to take shape. The Banks were growing more vocal about how much they expected me to help them financially. I knew they were counting on me to share my inheritance, even as they continued to drain it behind my back. But what they didn't realize was that I had already started tracking every penny. I'd managed to get access to the quarterly bank statements from my trust, and I meticulously logged every suspicious expense they made. Each month, I added to my records, compiling a list of big-ticket purchases that they had no way of affording on their own. I knew they'd never expect me to be keeping tabs on them, and that's exactly why it would work. Their greed was their downfall. By the time I was set to leave for college, I had a binder full of evidence, a chronological account of all the things they'd bought with money that wasn't meant for them. Their new Volvo, the trip to Hawaii, the cash gifts to the church that elevated them to local celebrity status. I listed every one, right down to the penny, alongside my trust fund statements showing the same amounts mysteriously missing. I was determined that someday they'd realize the full extent of my understanding. It was Kitty's college that marked a turning point for me. They'd saved up a significant amount of money, clearly pulling from my inheritance to cover her expenses. They wanted her to have a pristine start, free of student debt, and with every possible advantage. And while I don't hold any ill will against Kitty for this, I knew that the Banks saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone to that future. My education, my needs, none of that mattered to them as much as it did for Kitty. But while they planned and plotted, so did I. I was accepted to an out-of-state university on a partial scholarship, and as I prepared to leave, they grew increasingly insistent about my obligations to them. They seemed to think that as soon as I came into control of my inheritance, I'd willingly hand over a share of it, moved by gratitude for their generosity. It was almost funny the way they'd drop hints, sighing about how they'd invested so much in me, how they'd sacrificed so much for my well-being. It was as if they couldn't see the reality of what they'd done, or perhaps they were simply that deluded. But I never responded to their hints, just gave polite smiles and non-committal nods. I was counting down the days until I could finally break free from their manipulative grasp. As my departure drew closer, they didn't even bother seeing me off. They assumed I'd come back with open arms, ready to share the wealth once I accessed my inheritance. I wasn't about to let that happen. I already had my travel arranged, a small dorm room waiting for me, and a fresh start in my sights. I packed what little I had and left their house with a quiet resolve. They had used my family's money to bolster their own reputation, and I was about to return the favor in a way they would never forget. That fall, the church planned its annual antique sale, a massive event that drew people from all around. Mr. and Mrs. Banks, of course, made a big show of donating various items from my mom's collection, pieces they never had any right to claim. I decided this would be the perfect moment to make my move. 3 days before the sale, when the Banks were out on yet another shopping spree, I carefully packed up my mom's Baroque china set and took it to the church myself. When I arrived, I found the church's rummage sale committee members gathered around, organizing donations and setting up tables. I explained to them that Mrs. Banks wanted to make a generous donation in her name and that this set, a rare and valuable piece, was her heartfelt gift to the church. The ladies were beside themselves with excitement. They couldn't believe the beauty and value of the set. When I told them the estimated worth, their eyes widened. It would be the single most valuable donation in the history of the sale. The excitement around the donation was palpable. The ladies buzzed with joy, practically bouncing with gratitude as they thanked me for Mrs. Banks' generosity. They praised her in almost reverent tones, marveling at her supposed kindness. I had to work hard to keep a straight face as I played along. Yes, I told them, she was more than happy to donate this. It's in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks, after all. Inside, I was grinning at the thought of Mrs. Banks' reaction when she found out. I knew exactly how godly she'd feel when she saw her prized possession broken up and sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. The committee members had one question, though. They wanted to ensure that everything was above board, considering the rarity and value of the set. I gave them the contact information of an attorney in New York who could confirm that I had the legal right to offer the china set for sale on behalf of my family. They were more than satisfied and even more grateful. This was the sort of thing people dreamed of finding at a church sale. A rare, beautiful, complete china set with history. I knew nobody from our small town would be able to buy the entire set outright. Instead, they'd sell it piece by piece, so that more people could share in the joy of owning a part of such a unique collection. 3 days later, the antique sale was in full swing. By then, I was already gone, settled into my college dorm and enjoying my new beginning. But news travels fast in a small town, and it didn't take long for me to hear about what happened next. It turned out that the Banks were scheduled to volunteer at the sale, as they did every year on the second day. When Mrs. Banks saw the china set on display, her reaction was even more dramatic than I had anticipated. The moment she caught sight of it, she reportedly froze, her face draining of color. Then, like a dam breaking, her shock gave way to anger. She began demanding answers, accusing the ladies at the sale of stealing her china set. It was chaos, and Mrs. Banks was at the center of it, loudly insisting that this priceless possession was hers, that someone had obviously taken it without her permission. Her voice, usually so carefully modulated and controlled, rose in pitch as she demanded to know who was responsible. The church ladies, bless their hearts, were just as confused. They explained patiently at first that they had received the donation on her behalf. According to them, Mrs. Banks had given the china set to the church as an act of generosity. They even told her how grateful they were for her selflessness, which had become the talk of the congregation. Her donation had sparked admiration and even a bit of envy among the other churchgoers, many of whom couldn't believe such a valuable item had been given away. It was, in their eyes, the height of generosity. As I later heard from a friend, Mrs. Banks' reaction quickly turned into a scene that would be the talk of the town for years. Her shock and fury were so intense that she nearly started screaming, demanding to know who had bought each piece. She wanted the names, addresses, phone numbers, anything that could help her retrieve her property. But by then, the set was already dispersed, spread out among dozens of buyers who had happily paid to own a little piece of history. She'd been too late. The pieces had scattered like seeds in the wind, and she'd never be able to reassemble them. Her desperation was visible, but what shocked the onlookers most wasn't her outburst. It was how unchristian she appeared. Gone was the caring, godly woman they'd known. In her place was someone cold, selfish, and consumed by materialism. People murmured, exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disappointment. In a single afternoon, the reputation she'd worked so hard to build began to crumble, bit by bit, under the weight of her greed. Word spread quickly. By Sunday, almost everyone in the congregation had heard about her meltdown at the sale, and the tale grew with each retelling. Her reputation was stained, perhaps irreparably. To everyone else, she had proven herself to be more interested in material things than in the virtues she preached. People who once respected her saw her in a new light, questioning the sincerity of her faith and the authenticity of her charity. And Mrs. Banks didn't stop there. Determined to salvage her loss, she hired a lawyer in a frantic attempt to claim ownership of the china set. But, as I'd anticipated, her legal path was blocked. The attorney she spoke to informed her that the china was indeed part of my inheritance. Furthermore, since it had already been sold in small pieces, any effort to recover it would be fruitless. In one fell swoop, she had lost the set and destroyed her own reputation in the process. Around this time, I sent the Banks a package by registered mail. Inside was my binder, carefully organized and annotated, containing copies of my bank statements and a detailed list of every purchase they'd made using my parents' money. It wasn't just a stack of paper, it was a ledger of their deception, a record of every dollar they'd taken from me over the years. Accompanying the binder was a formal letter from my attorney, warning them against any future attempts to contact me for money. Any such attempt, it read, would be met with a legal bill and a court date. The package hit its mark. I didn't hear from them again. The Banks, who had always been so vocal, suddenly fell silent. They hadn't expected me to keep track, hadn't thought a young girl could piece together their financial misdeeds so meticulously. The fear of exposure, coupled with the threat of legal action, was enough to keep them at bay. Years passed, and I moved on with my life, leaving behind the bitter memories and forging my own path. 10 years later, I was working as a third-grade teacher in a different town. Teaching had always felt like the right fit for me, a way to give back to others without strings attached. I'd met my husband, a thoughtful accountant with a quiet sense of humor, and we'd started a family of our own, a 3-year-old son and a 1-year-old daughter who filled my days with joy. In time, Kitty and I reconnected. She'd grown up too, and had seen her parents for who they truly were. Kitty had ended up working her way through college, with no trace of the privileged, holier-than-thou attitude she'd once had. At one of our first lunches together, She apologized sincerely for the way she had acted back then, explaining that she had been shaped by her parents' attitudes and only saw their flaws as she grew older. Kitty and I became genuine friends. She, too, had become a teacher, and her husband, an engineer, was as down-to-earth as mine. We'd meet up several times a year, often with our children, who played together like cousins. Kitty and I had come a long way from the lives we'd shared under the same roof. While we were both teachers now, we also shared another bond, a mutual understanding of what it meant to grow up under the bank's roof and the lingering effects of their manipulative ways. Kitty confided in me about her years of therapy, saying she'd worked hard to untangle the beliefs and values her parents had tried to instill in her. She expressed relief that she'd been able to separate herself from them and create a life of her own, grounded in her values, not theirs. I think in some ways, reconnecting with Kitty gave me a sense of closure I hadn't even realized I needed. Seeing her apologize and grow into a genuinely kind, thoughtful person was proof that the bank's influence wasn't insurmountable. Over time, our families became like a second family to each other. Our kids played together, and we had regular family lunches where we could swap teaching stories, laugh over parenting mishaps, and share a little bit of the warmth we'd both missed growing up. As for Mr. and Mrs. Banks, their story didn't have the same happy ending. Over the years, their reputation in our small town had only worsened. People never forgot the scene Mrs. Banks made at the antique sale or the stories that spread afterward. They had tried to cling to their social standing, but word of their selfishness, greed, and hypocrisy had stuck. The church members, once supportive of them, grew distant. People talked behind their backs, and they became known as that couple who drove both their children away. Their financial situation took a downturn as well. Without access to my inheritance and without the steady flow of money they'd once taken for granted, they found themselves struggling. The new Volvo they had bought was eventually sold, and they scaled back their vacations, their social life shrinking along with their bank account. They stayed in that same small town because in the end, they couldn't afford to leave. For all their scheming, they hadn't prepared for a future without the funds they'd taken from me. And now, they were paying the price for it. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if they ever realized the depth of the pain they caused, or if they thought of me with any kind of remorse. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But in the end, their opinion didn't matter to me. I'd found my peace, my family, and my purpose, and that was more than enough. Kitty and I joke sometimes in a bittersweet way about our parents' different approaches to the idea of a wedding china set. Each of us had gone on to select our own china for our weddings, not because we felt we needed it, but because we wanted something that was truly ours, something that symbolized a fresh start. It wasn't about the china itself, but about the freedom to choose for ourselves, to create our own traditions unburdened by the past. Life went on. Kitty and I thrived in our own ways, building lives far from the twisted values of our childhood. We found meaning in our careers, comfort in our families, and healing in our friendship. And as for the banks, well, they were left with exactly what they had earned. Nothing more, nothing less. Thank you for watching.